On March 8, 1926, a Missouri horse trader named Ace Borger opened a lot sales office on 240 acres of bare Texas Panhandle prairie, and by nightfall had grossed more than $60,000. 90 days later, an estimated 45,000 people were living on that same dirt, which would have made this brand new settlement, conjured from nothing, the sixth largest city in the state of Texas. That number deserves a moment. Dallas in 1926 had about 160,000 people. San Antonio had around 160,000. And here was a patch of ground near the Canadian River that didn't have a single tree on it in January. And by summer, it had more people than Waco, more than Galveston, more than Beaumont. There was no existing town, no existing road, really, no existing water supply. Drinking water arrived by tank wagon until they could drill wells. What there was, underneath the scrub grass and the red clay, was oil. And oil in 1926 was the most potent magnet the American economy had ever produced. The man who struck that magnet knew exactly what he was doing. Asa Philip Borger, everybody called him Ace, was born in 1888 on a farm outside Sarcoxie, Missouri in Jasper County. He grew up a trader, a dealer, a man who understood that the real money in a boom was never in what came out of the ground. It was in the ground itself, the lots, the lumber, the hotel beds. The man who sold shovels to gold miners got rich. The man who sold town lots to oil chasers got richer. By 1915, Ace and his younger brother Pete were selling real estate in Pitcher, Oklahoma, in the middle of the lead and zinc boom feeding World War I munitions contracts. They made a modest profit, but the real education came 2 years later when they partnered with Tom Slick, the wildcatter they called the King of the Wildcatters, to build an entire town from scratch around a new oil strike between Tulsa and Bristow. The town was called Slick, Oklahoma. Under Slick's tutelage, the Borger brothers learned the formula. Buy land cheap, plat it into lots, sell the lots at enormous markup, organize a local government you control, build the lumber yard and the hotel yourself so you profit on both sides of every transaction, and push for a rail spur so your town connects to the wider economy. They did it again in 1922 at Cromwell, Oklahoma, in the Greater Seminole oil field. Cromwell was messy. The locals pushed back, forced Ace to share power, and he came away bitter, convinced he'd been too generous with people who didn't deserve it. So when Ace heard the reports from the Texas Panhandle in early 1926, he didn't just see another opportunity. He saw a chance to do the thing right. No locals to negotiate with, no existing power structure to accommodate. A blank slate, wide open, with the biggest oil strike the Panhandle had ever seen building toward a full-blown frenzy. He rode out to see it for himself on a winter day in 1926. From the crest of the highest rise he could find, the view was nothing but flat, treeless expanse and a single oil derrick. But that single derrick was the Smith No. 1, which had blown in at 10,000 barrels a day on January 11th, 1926, and that changed everything. By the end of that year, more than 800 wells would be drilled in the area. Peak production for the Panhandle field hit nearly 40 million barrels in 1927, principally from Hutchinson County, Ace's county. Ace moved with a speed that still astonishes. He paid a rancher named John Frank Weatherly $50 an acre for 240 acres, $12,000 total. He filed the paperwork with the state, organized the Borger Town Site Company with a capitalization of just $10,000 split into 100 shares, brought in his Oklahoma attorney, John R. Miller, and a Gulf Oil Company man named C.C. Horton as partners, and opened for business. The full-page advertisements he ran in the Amarillo dailies used a headline that was pure Ace Borger. Your opportunity lies in Borger, the new town of the plains. On Main Street and 3 others, lots measuring 20 by 120 feet sold for $1,500, with a down payment of $450. That first day's take was somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000, depending on whose accounting you trust. In 6 months, the Borger Town Site Company sold out completely, clearing more than $1 million on Ace's $12,000 investment. As a pure return on capital, it's hard to find a real estate play in the 1920s that beats it. What rose on that prairie was unlike anything the Panhandle had ever seen, and it rose with a speed that made experienced oilmen shake their heads. The Texas Panhandle in early 1926 was cattle country, quiet and enormous. Amarillo, the only significant town, had barely 15,000 people. The land north of the Canadian River was open range, ranches measured in sections, not acres. And the nearest city of any size was Oklahoma City, hundreds of miles to the northeast. Into that emptiness, Ace Borger poured a full-blown city in the time it takes most developers to get a building permit. Main Street stretched 3 miles long. Within weeks, a hotel and a jail had gone up, in that order, though both were needed with roughly equal urgency. A man named J.D. Williams, whom people called Big Heart, set up the first hamburger stand. A baker named Dilly built the Dilly Building to house his bakery downstairs and his family's apartment upstairs. Telephone service arrived. Steam-generated electricity followed. The Panhandle and Santa Fe Railway pushed a spur line through to Borger, and by October 1926, the city charter was adopted and Miller was elected mayor. A post office opened. A school district was established. A newspaper, the Hutchinson County Herald, started printing on November 23, 1926. In less than 8 months, Ace Borger had manufactured an entire functioning city. Neighboring ranchers, watching Ace's profits with obvious envy, platted their own town sites alongside his. John Weatherly created Isom, and James Whittenburg launched Dixon Creek. Both were eventually absorbed into the Borger city limits, as was Signal Hill, an oil camp to the northeast. The town of Whittenburg merged with another settlement called Pantex and became Phillips, named for the oil company, not any person's generosity. Borger was devouring its neighbors before it had celebrated its first birthday, and then it started to eat itself alive. The problem was baked into the design. Ace Borger had learned in Cromwell that controlling the town meant controlling the government, and controlling the government meant installing your own people. Miller, his attorney, became mayor. That was predictable. But Miller's next move was the one that would define Borger for the rest of the decade. He brought in a man named Richard Herwig. Two-Gun Dick Herwig, they called him, for the pair of pearl-handled revolvers that seemed permanently attached to his hips, and made him the town's chief law enforcement officer. Herwig was under indictment for murder back in Cromwell. He had reportedly served less than 10 years of a 99-year sentence in Oklahoma before buying his way out. This was the man tasked with keeping the peace. Herwig, of course, had no intention of keeping the peace. He had every intention of keeping the profits. He brought a crew of felons with him from Oklahoma to staff his marshal's force, and their primary occupation was not policing. It was collecting. Weekly fees from bootleggers, weekly fines from prostitutes. Herwig's network of stills produced rot-gut whiskey that 24-hour saloons like the Rattlesnake Inn and the Bloody Bucket were required to purchase. The whole operation was a franchise, with Herwig as the franchisor and every criminal in town paying a cut. The center of all of it was Dixon Street, later renamed with quiet optimism 10th Street. Dixon Street ran parallel to Main 1 block over, and it became one of the most concentrated vice districts in the American Southwest. Brothels, dance halls, gambling dens fitted with slot machines, speakeasies that didn't bother to speak all that easy. A madam known as Ma Murphy, another Cromwell import, ran the prostitution with her husband, Pa Murphy, managing logistics. A bootlegger named W.J. Popejoy, his nickname was Shine, earned the title King of the Texas Bootleggers, which in 1927 was no small distinction. Other figures drifted through with names that sounded invented for pulp fiction but weren't. Yellow Young, Spider Gibson, Wireline Yerke. The people who gave Borger its less flattering nickname, Boogertown, were not being cute. Two of Sheriff Joe Ownby's deputies were gunned down on a Borger street by Herwig's men. There was no arrest. Murder and robbery became, in the dry phrasing of the Texas State Historical Association, commonplace. Borger, in its first year, was not a rough town the way a cattle town might be rough, with the occasional Saturday night brawl. It was a town where the criminal element didn't just operate alongside the law. It was the law. The badge and the gun and the still were all held by the same hands. While all of this was happening, while Dixon Street was running wide open and bodies were turning up and the bootleg whiskey was flowing, something else was happening too, and this part tends to get lost. A genuine economy was building. Oil companies were investing heavily. The most consequential arrival was Frank Phillips, the co-founder of Phillips Petroleum out of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Phillips built a natural gas liquids processing plant near Borger in 1926. And in 1927, he purchased the existing Alamo refinery, a modest 1,500-barrel-per-day operation. It was Phillips Petroleum's first refinery anywhere in the world, a company that by 1927 had assets of $266 million and was pumping 55,000 barrels a day from more than 2,000 wells across Oklahoma and Texas. That small plant would grow into the Phillips 66 Borger refinery, which today processes more than 146,000 barrels per day and remains one of the largest employers in the Texas Panhandle. In November 1927, a fire destroyed the Dixon Creek Oil Company refinery, causing more than $60,000 in damage. A reminder that the industrial infrastructure being built in Borger was volatile in every sense. But the investment kept coming. In 1930, Phillips laid a pipeline from Borger to St. Louis, Illinois, the first multi-product batching pipeline in the world, designed to transport different refined products in sequence through the same line, later extended all the way to Chicago. Gasoline, refined from Panhandle crude, could now reach customers more than 1,000 miles away. The infrastructure of a permanent industrial city was being built, right alongside the brothels and the moonshine stills. The tension between those two Borgers, the Lawless camp and the industrial powerhouse, could not hold forever. 500 miles south in Austin, a new governor named Daniel J. Moody had taken office on January 18, 1927. Moody was 33 years old, the youngest governor in Texas history at the time, a former Williamson County district attorney, and he had no patience for what he was hearing about Hutchinson County. Petitions were arriving on his desk from Borger citizens who wanted law and order and were terrified to say so publicly. Investigative reports detailed an apparatus of corruption that would have been impressive in Chicago, let alone a town that hadn't existed 18 months earlier. Within his first 3 months in office, Moody sent Captain Frank Hamer of the Texas Rangers on an inspection tour of Borger. Hamer spent 2 days there. On April 6, 1927, he filed a report that contained one of the more memorable assessments in the history of Texas law enforcement. The worst crime ring I have seen in my 23 years as an officer exists in Borger. Hamer, it's worth noting, was not a man given to exaggeration. 7 years later, he would lead the ambush that killed Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow on a Louisiana back road. That was all Moody needed to hear. He dispatched 8 Rangers under the joint command of Captains William W. Sterling and Tom Hickman, with crystal-clear orders not to return until the Lawless unconditionally surrender. When Sterling arrived in Borger on April 17th, a reporter asked him how he planned to make the criminals behave. His answer was succinct. Where the criminals have been killing officers, we are going to kill off some crooks. The rhetorical shot had its intended effect. A great many of Borger's gamblers, bootleggers, and assorted predators decided that the Texas Panhandle had suddenly lost its charm and departed in haste. Two-gun Dick Herwig, the man with the pearl-handled revolvers and the murder indictment, was instantly and permanently unemployed. The Rangers dismantled what sources describe as 24 illicit establishments, shut down the stills, and compelled the worst offenders to leave town. They declared Borger 100% better. The declaration was premature by a wide margin. Within 3 months, the criminals were back. The slot machines reappeared. The brothels reopened on Dixon Street. More than 20 gambling joints resumed business. Sheriff Ownby took no action and was widely believed to be receiving payoffs. Borger was a city that couldn't stay cleaned up because the people running it didn't want it cleaned up. Around this same time, the exact date is debated, either late 1926 or early 1927, an artist arrived in Borger. Thomas Hart Benton, a Missouri-born painter who had served in the Navy in World War I and was teaching art in New York, came to the Panhandle on a summer sketching trip. He took an apartment on the second floor of the Dilly Building, the bakery building on Main Street, and from that window he watched Borger. He watched the cars, swarms of them, more than you'd expect in a town this remote. He watched the fistfights break out on the street below. He watched the oil derricks on the horizon, the black smoke billowing from them, the telegraph poles cutting vertical lines against the sky. He watched the men, almost all men, with no wives, no children, no picket fences in sight, fighting and dealing and drinking and looking for the fortune that had brought them here. Benton made sketches, and back in New York in 1928, he turned those sketches into a painting he called Boomtown, oil on canvas, 45 by 54 inches. It depicted Main Street in Borger with characteristic Benton dynamism, undulating figures, cars, buildings, the derricks and smoke in the background, a fight in the foreground that he'd actually witnessed on a different day. It was not a photographic rendering. Benton combined scenes, compressed time, exercised artistic liberty. But his verbal description of what he'd seen carried a kind of rueful wonder. Borger on the Boom, Benton wrote, was a big party where capital joined hands with everybody in a great democratic dance. He noted that despite the rough shacks and dirty tents, there was no feeling of the narrow cruelty and bitter misery of Eastern industrial centers. There was a belief, he said, written in men's faces, that all would find a share in the gifts of this mushroom town. Benton called Boomtown one of his best paintings and one of his most important early regionalist works. It now hangs in the Memorial Art Gallery at the University of Rochester in upstate New York, 1,700 miles from the window of the Dilly Building where the sketches were made. A reproduction is displayed at the Hutchinson County Historical Museum in downtown Borger, where it is the most requested piece in the collection. The belief Benton saw in those faces, the conviction that everyone would get their share, was the same belief that kept people pouring in even as the bodies piled up. It was also the belief that made what came next feel like a betrayal. On the evening of September 18, 1929, District Attorney John A. Holmes was assassinated. Holmes had been appointed by Governor Moody specifically to investigate and prosecute the criminals who had reinfested Borger after the Rangers' first cleanup. He had been threatened repeatedly. He pressed on anyway, and someone, the killer was never conclusively identified, gunned him down. There is a dispute in the sources about the exact location. Some say he was shot in the street, others say near his home. The result was the same. The elected prosecutor of the 84th Judicial District of Texas was dead, and his murder was the final provocation. 48 hours after the killing, the Rangers were back in Borger. 2 weeks later, on September 28, 1929, Governor Moody signed a proclamation declaring martial law in Hutchinson County. This was not a figure of speech. This was the actual suspension of civilian government. National Guard troops from Fort Worth arrived by special train. At 9 a.m. on Sunday, September 29, 1929, Borger was officially placed under martial law. The town of Stinnett, the county seat 10 miles away, followed an hour later. Brigadier General Jacob F. Walters, who had previous experience shutting down lawless towns under military authority, was placed in command. On Monday morning, 84 state troopers disembarked at the Borger train station, arriving on a special train consisting of baggage cars, 3 Pullmans, and freight cars, and proceeded directly to City Hall. They took it over. Then they took the jail. Local law enforcement officers were disarmed. One was arrested on the spot. The Rangers also seized a reporter for the local Daily Herald on the grounds of adverse publicity in his coverage of their activities, a move that drew criticism as a free speech violation, but signaled exactly how little the military authorities cared about local sensibilities. General Walters later wrote about the psychological effect of the operation, the sight of armed soldiers marching through the streets of an American city in peacetime, which was precisely the point. The message was not subtle. You had your chance to govern yourselves, and you failed. By mid-October, Sheriff Joe Ownby and Mayor Glenn Pace had resigned under pressure. Federal officials moved in alongside the state troops, arresting drug dealers and gamblers, and securing multiple criminal convictions. The local government was not reformed. It was replaced, root and branch. Martial law was lifted after approximately a month. The Associated Press reported on October 14th that it was expected to end within days following the forced resignations of Sheriff Ownby and Mayor Pace. Federal officials moved in alongside the state troops, arresting drug dealers and gamblers and securing multiple criminal convictions. The local government was not reformed. It was replaced, root and branch. What followed was not peace exactly. The violence sputtered on for years, but the syndicate was broken. Dixon Street would never run wide open again. But the boom was over. Not just the crime boom, but the population boom, the wild energy, the feeling Benton had captured of a town where anything was possible. The 1930 census, taken a few months later, recorded the official population of Borger at 6,532. The 45,000 figure from 1926 had been mostly transient, roughnecks, speculators, drifters, prostitutes, con men, and they were gone. What remained was the beginning of a real town, but a much smaller one than anyone had imagined. Ace Borger himself watched all of this from an increasingly uncomfortable distance. He had become wealthy, genuinely wealthy, not just boomtown wealthy. He owned a string of Panhandle wheat elevators and 19,000 acres of farmland in Hansford County. He had opened Borger's first bank and established a lumber yard. He took out full-page ads promoting settlement not just in Borger, but in other oil-rich sites across West Texas and eastern New Mexico. In 1927, he and Pete had even started developing the town of Stinnett, the Hutchinson County seat, 10 miles north. He moved his family back to Carthage, Missouri for a time so his children could attend the schools there. He was a man who understood that the chaos he'd midwifed was not the place to raise a family. But the money that built Ace Borger also destroyed him. In June 1930, he opened the Borger State Bank, installing himself as president and his son Philip as vice president. The bank failed, wiping out local businessmen and small depositors and causing a minor panic. Borger was convicted of receiving deposits in an insolvent bank and sentenced to 2 years in prison, a judgment he appealed. The town builder had become a cautionary tale, the man whose name was on the city, on the bank, and now on a criminal conviction. Among those burned by the bank's failure was a man named Arthur Huey, the Hutchinson County treasurer. Huey had his own problems. He'd been jailed for embezzlement of county funds, and he reportedly asked Ace Borger to help bail him out. Borger refused. Huey made threats. On August 31st, 1934, Ace Borger walked into the Borger post office to pick up his mail. According to witnesses, Arthur Huey walked in behind him carrying a Colt .45, shouted obscenities, and shot him 5 times. Huey then took Borger's own .44 caliber pistol and fired 4 more rounds. A bystander named Lloyd Duncan, a superintendent for the Magnolia Petroleum Company, was hit in the crossfire. He died 5 days later. Ace Borger was dead at 46, killed in the post office of the town that bore his name. One witness, a woman named Catherine Haydee, reported hearing someone say, "You, get your gun," just before the shooting started. A wrestling promoter named Carl Maddox, standing at the post office door, quoted Huey as muttering, "Call the sheriff. Ace Borger has made a criminal out of me." The trial was held in Canadian Texas. Huey claimed self-defense, arguing that Borger had been gunning for him. The jury believed him and voted to acquit. 3 years later, Huey was convicted of theft of county funds and sent to the state penitentiary after all. The man who killed Borger's founder went to prison, but not for killing Borger's founder. Ace was buried in Llano Cemetery in Amarillo. His sons, Philip and Jack, left the area. His daughter, Helen, stayed and lived in her parents' brick home with her husband, Fritz Thompson. That house is now a Texas historical landmark, still owned by the family. The man who built Borger is gone. The house where he slept is a monument. The post office where he died is not. And then something remarkable happened, though it happened slowly enough that nobody would have called it remarkable at the time. Borger survived. The Great Depression, which should have killed a town so dependent on a single commodity, instead forced Borger through a painful transformation. Oil and gas prices dropped, and the boom that had built the place was definitively over. But the refineries stayed. Phillips Petroleum and other companies continued to operate profitably from the fields around Borger, and a new industry emerged: carbon black. Carbon black is the fine, sooty powder produced by burning natural gas, and it was an essential ingredient in the manufacture of synthetic rubber, particularly for automobile tires. The process, as practiced in the 1930s, was spectacularly dirty. Plants burned natural gas in channels or furnaces and collected the resulting soot, releasing vast quantities of airborne carbon into the sky. Texas in the 1930s produced roughly 75% of the nation's supply, and Borger became one of the major production centers. By the mid-1930s, multiple carbon black plants operated in and around Hutchinson County. Companies like United Carbon, J.M. Huber, Texas Elf Carbon, Panhandle Carbon. Their output measured in hundreds of millions of pounds per year. The irony was grim. During the Dust Bowl, the carbon black plants added their own industrial soot to the storms already sweeping across the Panhandle. The locals called them black dusters, storms that mixed prairie dust with carbon black and turned midday into midnight. A museum administrator in Borger later described how parents had to keep wet sheets draped over their babies' bassinets. Otherwise, the stuff was so thick it could suffocate an infant. Dust pneumonia, caused by an excess of particulate matter in the lungs, killed children in the Panhandle during those years. The same industry that was slowly poisoning the air was also keeping people employed. Okie migrants, tractored off their foreclosed farms in Oklahoma, drifted into Borger and found work in the plants and refineries. The Works Progress Administration paved streets, red brick, solid, permanent, and the ramshackle boom shacks were finally torn down and replaced with real buildings. For the first time, Borger started to look like a town that intended to stay. World War II accelerated the transformation. Synthetic rubber, high-octane aviation fuel, and other petroleum products became critical to the war effort, and Borger's refining and petrochemical complex was perfectly positioned to supply them. Phillips Petroleum's Borger refinery had already pioneered the HF alkylation process that made high-octane aviation gasoline possible, a contribution to the Allied war effort that rarely makes the history books, but kept fighters and bombers in the air across 2 oceans. The plant that Frank Phillips had built from a 1,500-barrel-per-day shoestring operation was now a strategic national asset. Population climbed to 14,000 by 1943 and kept growing. After the war, the growth continued. The Hutchinson County Airport was constructed north of town in 1949. In 1948, the city established Borger City Junior College, later renamed Frank Phillips College, named, of course, for the oil man whose refinery had become the town's economic spine. The college sits on the same flat ground where roughnecks and bootleggers once scrambled for a living. And today it serves about 1,500 students, many of them training for careers in the petrochemical industry that their grandfathers helped build. By the 1960s, Borger was one of the largest centers for oil, carbon black, and petrochemical production in the state of Texas. The Phillips 66 pipeline connected Panhandle crude to markets across the Midwest. The Borger News-Herald, which had started as the Hutchinson County Herald in November 1926, was still publishing daily. The population peaked in 1960 at 20,911, a number that seemed to suggest Borger had found its permanent size, that the volatility of the boom years had finally settled into the steady rhythm of an industrial town that knew what it was for. In 1969, the city received a designation that would have seemed like a punchline 40 years earlier. Borger, Texas, was named an All-American City. The town that had required martial law to suppress its own crime syndicate, the town where the district attorney had been assassinated and the founder shot dead in the post office, was now being held up as a model American community. The brick streets the WPA had laid were lined with churches, 50 of them. There were 24 city parks. There were schools and a library and a hospital and a junior college. The Hutchinson County Museum opened in 1977 and immediately placed a reproduction of Benton's Boomtown at the center of its collection, as if to say, remember what we were, look at what we became. But the population number from 1960, that 20,911, turned out to be a ceiling, not a floor. By 1970, Borger had dropped to 14,195. That is a loss of nearly 7,000 people in a single decade, a decline of more than 30%. It stabilized in the 1980s at around 15,000, drifted down to 14,000 by 2000, fell to 13,251 in 2010, and to 12,551 in 2020. The most recent estimates put it around 11,700, declining at roughly 1% a year. 95% of similarly sized American cities are growing faster. What happened was not dramatic. There was no single disaster, no catastrophic fire, no company pulling out overnight. What happened was the long, slow mathematics of a one-industry town in an era of consolidation. The refineries and petrochemical plants grew more efficient, which meant they needed fewer workers. Automation replaced roughnecks. The oil field work that once employed hundreds of men per well site could be done by a fraction of that number. Corporate mergers. Phillips Petroleum merged with Conoco in 2002 to form Conoco Phillips, which later spun off its refining assets as Phillips 66. Shifted decision-making to Houston, 1,000 miles away. Executives in glass towers on the Gulf Coast made choices about headcount and capital expenditure for a refinery on the flat Panhandle plains. And the people in Borger had about as much say in those decisions as Ace Borger's roughnecks had in the price of crude. The young people who graduated from Frank Phillips College discovered that there were more opportunities elsewhere and left, the way young people leave small towns all over America. Except that in Borger, there was no second industry to absorb them. There was no university to anchor a knowledge economy, no military installation to guarantee federal dollars, no tourist draw to bring in outside spending. There was oil, refined and processed in a dozen different ways, and when the oil economy needed fewer people stayed. The Phillips 66 Borger refinery still operates. It still processes more than 146,000 barrels a day, still employs hundreds of people, still anchors the local economy. Chevron Phillips Chemical Company runs what is described as the world's largest inland petrochemical complex nearby. Sid Richardson Carbon Company still produces carbon black for rubber tires. The bones of a serious industrial economy remain. But the population that those industries once supported has contracted by more than 40% from its peak, and nothing on the horizon suggests a reversal. Dixon Street, 10th Street now, the street where Herwig's people ran the brothels and the gambling dens and the bootleg whiskey operations, is a quiet stretch of residential and commercial lots in a small Texas Panhandle town. The Dilly Building, where Thomas Hart Benton watched the chaos of Main Street from a second-floor window and sketched the painting that would become his first regionalist masterpiece, is no longer a bakery. Borger's 3-mile-long Main Street still runs through the center of town, but it serves a city of 12,000, not 45. The painting itself hangs in Rochester, New York, in a university art gallery, one of the most requested and reproduced works in the collection. It shows up in middle school and high school textbooks across the country. Students study the undulating figures, the cars, the derricks, the smoke, and they learn about regionalism and American art. Very few of them have ever been to Borger. Very few of them know that the window from which Benton sketched was above a bakery, or that the fight in the foreground actually happened, or that the town in the painting would require the Texas National Guard to impose military rule 2 years after the paint dried. Ace Borger's brick house still stands. His descendants still own it. It carries a Texas historical marker, which means the state has officially recognized the home of a man who was convicted of bank fraud, shot dead by a county treasurer, and acquitted posthumously by the jury of history on the grounds that, whatever else he did, he built a town. The town outlived him by 9 decades and counting. There is a Motel 6 in Borger called the Boomtown. There is a Hutchinson County Museum where you can see the Benton reproduction and the artifacts of the county's oil field past. There is a Hampton Inn on Wilson Street and a Holiday Inn Express on the same road. There are 50 churches for 12,000 people, which is either a sign of deep faith or a lot of empty pews, or both. The refinery runs, the carbon black plants run. The pipeline that Frank Phillips laid to St. Louis in 1930, the first multi-product batching pipeline in the world, still carries product to the Midwest. In a sense, the infrastructure won. The promoters and the criminals and the roughnecks and the rangers all came and went, but the pipes in the ground and the cracking towers on the horizon turned out to be the permanent part. The people were the temporary part. 40 million barrels of oil came out of Hutchinson County in 1927, the peak year. The Panhandle field averaged more than 120,000 barrels a day from 427 wells. That oil paid for everything: the lots, the streets, the railway spur, the refinery, the pipeline, the schools, the churches, the college. It also paid for Dixon Street, for two-gun Dick Herwig's pearl-handled revolvers, for Shine Popejoy's moonshine empire, for the murders that brought the Rangers, for the assassination that brought the National Guard. It was all the same money. Oil money does not distinguish between a church and a brothel. It flows to wherever there is demand. Benton saw that. In his painting, the smoke from the derricks and the energy of the street and the violence of the fight are all one composition, inseparable, all part of the same swirling American moment. He didn't moralize about it. He painted it the way it was, everything happening at once, the construction and the destruction, the money and the blood, the extraordinary vitality of a place that had no business existing and existed anyway, furiously, for a little while. The population of Borger, Texas in 2026 is approximately 11,700 and falling. The Benton painting hangs in Rochester, New York. The lot where Ace Borger opened for business on March 8, 1926, and sold $60,000 worth of dirt before sundown, is part of a quiet panhandle city that has been getting quieter for 60 years. Dixon Street is 10th Street. The Rattlesnake Inn is gone. The Bloody Bucket is gone. The post office where Ace Borger was shot is not a landmark. His house is. On a clear day, you can still see the smoke from the refinery.